Well, the collapse of Afghanistan continues. It's getting worse and worse by the hour. There are these ghastly videos now going around on Twitter, which I originally thought, oh no, this can't be what that is. And until more videos of it started to come out, and we got a clearer and clearer picture. And it turns out that these folks, see, we all remember the videos and the pictures from Vietnam in 1975, where the folks were grabbing onto that last helicopter as it was taking off from the rooftop of the embassy, and they were, holding up their babies and saying, "Please, just take my child, even if you won't take me." And they're grabbing onto the helicopter and for dear life, and of course they end up getting left behind or falling off or whatever. Well, the folks in Afghanistan are doing the exact same thing, but with C-17 Globemasters, massive cargo planes, with huge jet engines. I mean, frankly, it was frightening to me just to see people, running in front alongside these planes, because I'm thinking, no, you're going to get sucked into the turbine. But luckily that didn't happen. But what did happen was folks were grabbing onto the plane for dear life, trying to hold on to it just to get out of the country, and essentially be stowaways in the American planes. And well, they didn't make it inside the plane. They were stuck on the outside when the planes took off, and they fell to their deaths. And this is not something to make fun of. It's a sad thing to see, and for many reasons, it did not have to be this way. I'm not a fan of nation building. I don't think that the U.S. should have ever been there to begin with. But this withdrawal, everybody had a lot of notice, as I've said. They had over a year of notice. People have known for years and years and years. Eventually, the American presence was going to go away. We also knew that the Afghan government that the U.S. tried to establish was, to borrow a phrase from Scott Horton, a fool's errand. They did not understand Afghan culture, and so it was impossible to craft a state that would ever be even minimally stable, that was at all feasible to govern that society. And so given that, especially people who live there, they should have understood that I need to be ready to get out of here. I need to go. Whenever the American troops are gone, I need to be out of here. But a lot of these folks didn't seem to realize that until the Taliban were already roaming the streets of their city. The folks who live in the capital, I'd imagine, are probably the most cosmopolitan Afghans, the folks who maybe have the loosest morals, which isn't to say that they are hedonists by any stretch of, by Western standards, but compared to the Taliban, they're not the most pious Muslims on the planet, I'd imagine. And so they would have good reason to fear culturally a Taliban government. And also, there are many, many ethnic groups who are not Pashtuns in Afghanistan. Of course, the Taliban are Pashtuns. They're the largest ethnic group, but they're only about 42%. So that means that you've got 58% of the country that speak a different language and are from a different tribe. Well, there's a lot of Pashtun tribes, I believe, but from a totally different ethnic group than the Taliban. And these folks should have known, ever since the deal was signed between the U.S. and the Taliban last year in 2020, again, something that almost nobody talked about here in the United States. I don't know if folks talked about it in Afghanistan, but in the U.S. there was a total blackout. I'm one of the only people who ever discussed it. I only know that it existed because I listened to the Scott Horton show a lot, and Scott Horton mentioned that Zalmay Khalilzad was appointed by Trump to negotiate a peace deal with the Taliban. And so I followed that deal until it was completed. When it was completed, I said, okay, there we are. U.S. is going to be gone May of 2021. And so anyone who wanted to be out of that country should have made their plans to leave by last May. Now, just because Biden pushed back the final date to September 11th for purely political arbitrary reasons, these folks should have been prepared for May, to leave in May, as I said yesterday. And that goes not only for the people, for the Afghan civilians who don't want to live under Taliban rule. It goes for the U.S. For the U.S. military and for all of the U.S. collaborators who the U.S. has promised to get out of the country so that they don't have to face the wrath of the Taliban, because there would certainly be retribution, I would think, to some extent, for folks who were a part of a collaborationist regime. They would be treated as kisslings. And the U.S. should have had all these people out of there a long time ago. Even if they were going to push the date back to September 11th, officially, they should have known that there was no guarantee from the deal. The Taliban made their deal. They were going to keep calm until May. May came and went. The U.S. didn't lift a finger to get their people out of there, and now they're trying to scramble to get at least the American citizens out. And then you've got everybody else running onto the tarmac at the Kabul airport, at Hamid Karzai International Airport, begging to be flown away. And so, no, this isn't a good scene. It's not a good look. In practice, would things have been a whole lot different had they gotten out by May? Only marginally. It just wouldn't have looked as bad. The Taliban would have still taken over the country, yes. But the folks who wanted to get out, maybe would have, they should have had more of a chance. And I don't know. People say, oh, well, this wouldn't have happened if Trump was still president. Who knows how well, the withdrawal in May would have been under Trump. I mean, I can assume that it would have been better than this, because at least they wouldn't have been doing it under the pressure of having the Taliban at the gates of the city. The Taliban, if we had the same time schedule for the Taliban, wouldn't have been there in May, and their attacks wouldn't have come for, let's say a month or so after the U.S. withdrawal. Oh, and did I mention that apparently now the White House or the Pentagon is going to send a few thousand American troops back to Afghanistan to try and evacuate people? I don't know how that works, because then that's a few more thousand people you have to get out of there later. It just, especially when you've got the Taliban already fully in control. What are you doing sending back American troops? This is all it's a slightly bigger mess than it should have been, or than it could have been. Obviously, you can't avoid a big mess when it was a 20-year-long big mess. And so there was going to be a bit of a mess in trying to extract yourself from that, but it didn't have to be quite this bad. And so with that said, I want to do a bit of a post-mortem on the Afghan regime and explain a little bit for people who are maybe a bit confused. Hey, $2 trillion and 20 years later, how is it that this regime collapses overnight with no resistance? Why was there not a single battle fought by the supposedly 300,000-man strong army? Which, that's a big army that's been trained for 20 years. A whole generation of soldiers who were born, under American rule and trained by the Americans should exist in this military. Well, the reason why this all fell apart so quickly and why none of it was ever sustainable was that the U.S. wanted Afghanistan to be something that it never will be, and that is a Western nation state with a unified national culture, a single language, single creed, single religion, all these things. And that's just simply not what Afghanistan is. Afghanistan is a land between a bunch of other countries where a whole bunch of different tribes happen to live and, under the best of circumstances, coexist. That's it. The best you can hope for is that these people will coexist. They're not going to be like France. They're not going to be like Germany. They're not going to be like Italy or Spain. They're not a nation state. And so when you try to impose this Western parliamentary centralized framework upon what is not even a unified society, what is a bunch of little small tribes, they're going to just fight with each other over the state. And so therefore it's going to be impossible. Even those of the people who supported the state or who opposed the Taliban, they're not going to be able to unify together to fight the Taliban because they're too busy trying to fight over control of this non-Taliban state. Because when you have centralized authority, whoever's at the top of that pyramid has absolute power. That's the same problems that we're experiencing here in the United States. It's the same reason why Afghanistan came unglued as why we are coming unglued. And so in order for Afghanistan to work, the U.S. would have had to give autonomy to all these different communities within Afghanistan, let them build up their own small militaries to defend their own territories from the Taliban or whoever, And then maybe this would have had a chance. But when you've got, a Tajik soldier stationed in an Uzbek town and the Taliban come, rolling in, is the Tajik going to say, you know what, I think I'm going to fight and die to protect the Uzbeks today? No, they're going to say, screw this, I'm going to go home. I'm going to go defend my own people. I don't care about you. And especially, you think they're going to care about the guy next to them if they're sitting in a trench with somebody who doesn't even speak the same language as them? That's the thing, is the U.S. military had 20 years to figure this out. They had 20 years to figure out that Afghanistan is not a nation state. And they never did. They just kept trying to impose this very rigid Western political ideology on them, and it never was going to take. You're dealing with a country that was perhaps even more divided than the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and certainly more than Yugoslavia. And so if you were going to try and make build some kind of regime to rule over that kind of a country, you were going to have to take extraordinary measures and learn from the mistakes of Austria and Yugoslavia. And there's nothing that I can really blame that on, because it's not like the information wasn't available. I'm not some big genius. I'm not the first person who's thought of this. It's just simply that the U.S. imperial authorities were exceedingly ignorant, or exceedingly arrogant, as well as ignorant. They were so arrogant that they could, turn Afghanistan into the next West Germany or Japan. They thought that, it was through their own, divine will and American exceptionalism that they were able to civilize the Japanese and the Germans. It never occurred to them that the Germans and the Japanese were already largely civilized and unified to begin with, and that, this structure, this government that the U.S. imposed on West Germany and Japan was just something that happened to already work well with the kind of society that they had. Germany and Japan were nation states. They were very nationalistic already during World War II. The U.S. wanted them to be, in fact, less nationalistic. Whereas in the case of Afghanistan, they were trying to get these people to be more nationalistic, and that just simply was not going to happen. It was never going to work. They were not even, the mission in Afghanistan, even if the mission was nation building, it was not even a noble mission. It was never going to succeed. You can't change these people that much, and it's wrong of you to think that that's even something that you should do. You have to deal with the world as it is, not the world as you would like it to be. There's no room in the global world order or in world history for imperial idealism. And the only folks I hear even bringing this up, because I was listening to the radio quite a bit today, were individual soldiers who served in Afghanistan, were at Camp Leatherneck, engaged in the training, and they were calling and saying, hey, there might have been a problem with what we were doing over there, because you see, all these guys, they didn't really like each other. They didn't really care about each other. They weren't really, they didn't really act like us Americans. They weren't, proud to serve in their military. They had all these differences. And so these guys who were on the ground could see that. But no one in the Pentagon cared, or really thought much about this stuff. And the ordinary Americans and the politicians certainly have no concept of this. And so no lessons will be learned from this. I mean, a good enough lesson would just be don't try and build nations. That's not a good idea in and of itself. It's not right. It's not your role to do it. But people won't even take away the message that, hey, if you're going to do it, there's a way to do it. You have to actually look at what you're doing. You have to think through things. You don't just say, hey, we're going to occupy this country for a couple decades, and at the end of it, they're going to be Americans. Because that's not going to happen. It reminds me a lot of the arrogance of the communists who thought that, hey, if we could just impose a communist system on these non-communist societies, it will, yes, human nature, as we see it today, might contradict, the principles of communism, but we will see the birth of a new socialist man. And I feel like the Americans kind of do the same thing, to where, yes, we might be violating, the basic tenets of Afghan society and what we're trying to do, but we'll give birth to a new Afghan man, a new, more American man. And just as the Soviets found out before them across the planet, you cannot change people so easily. There are things that are important to people: traditions, cultures, language, religion, customs. And people don't give those things up so easily just because they're told to. As Jimmy Dore put it a few days ago, you don't just march into Afghanistan, build a Starbucks and a McDonald's, and overnight, or even over 20 years, they turn into a little America. I mean, if there were so many people in Kabul itself who supported the U.S. regime, the U.S. should have, just granted independence to, all of Afghanistan that wasn't, Kabul, or just grant independence to the Pashtun areas and say, hey, you guys go crazy, do whatever you want, and spend these $2 trillion. Where you're going to spend all this money. Maybe do it building a wall around the Pashtuns and say, hey, Pashtuns, you guys can govern yourselves. You're off there, and then everybody else can be together. But everybody else didn't want to be a part of the same country either. But I mean, you have to divide authority. You're not going to have a single government rule all of these people. So I doubt this will be the last thing I say about Afghanistan, because Biden will be speaking here in a few minutes as at the time of recording this. So I might have another thing to say about Afghanistan tomorrow. But I mean, this is a major moment in American history. It's the end of America's longest war, and it is, one of the greatest failures in the history of American foreign policy. And I only say greatest, one of the greatest, because there's so many great failures. I don't have time to think through all of them right now. So, with that said, I will see you folks back here tomorrow.